The woman who stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, on a Tuesday morning in April of 1878 gave her name as Clara Voss. But the name was a lie, and Aaron Bishop knew it the moment she said it. He was leaning against the post outside the land office when the coach rolled in, dust billowing behind it in great brown curtains, and he watched the way she descended the steps with the careful, deliberate movement of a person who had rehearsed the moment many times in private. She wore a gray dress that had been good once, before too many washes had pulled the color thin, and she carried a single leather satchel pressed against her side like it contained something she could not afford to lose. Her hair was the color of dark honey, pinned up beneath a traveling bonnet that had seen better years. She looked like 100 other women who had come west with hope pressed between their ribs and not much else. But when the stage agent called out the passenger names from his register and said the name Clara Voss, there was a half-second pause before she turned her head. Just half a second. A person who was not paying close attention would have missed it entirely. Aaron Bishop was always paying close attention. He was 28 years old that April, and he had spent 6 of those years working as the county land agent for Sumner County, which meant he had learned to read people the way other men read weather. He could tell you whether a homesteader was filing in good faith or planning to cut and run before the winter came. He could tell when a cattle baron was lying about the acreage of his range. He had developed an instinct for the small betrayals that people gave away, without knowing they were giving anything away at all. He watched the woman who called herself Clara Voss collect herself, smooth her skirt with one hand, and approach the agent's table with her chin lifted at precisely the right angle, not too high to seem arrogant, not too low to seem frightened. Exactly the right angle for someone performing confidence. He went back inside the land office and said nothing. Her business in Caldwell turned out to be simple enough on the surface. She had come in response to an advertisement placed by a widow named Ruth Calloway, who owned 40 acres outside of town and needed a housekeeper and sometimes schoolteacher for the small settlement of families that had grown up around Calloway Creek. The advertisement had run in 3 Kansas newspapers and 2 back east, and apparently this woman had answered it. Aaron knew Ruth Calloway well. Everyone in Caldwell knew Ruth Calloway, who was 63 years old and had buried a husband and 2 sons, and still ran her farm with the quiet determination of a woman who had decided long ago that grief was a thing you carried in your coat pocket rather than on your sleeve. He saw the woman who called herself Clara Voss walking out toward Calloway Creek that same afternoon, her satchel in hand, the Kansas wind pressing her skirts flat against her legs and pulling strands of dark honey hair loose from her bonnet. He watched her go and turned back to his work and thought, carefully, that it was none of his business. He kept that thought for approximately 3 days. On Thursday, Ruth Calloway came into town to file some papers regarding a fence line dispute with her neighbor, and she brought her new housekeeper with her, which was how Aaron Bishop found himself sitting across a narrow wooden desk from the woman who had given a false name, close enough to see that her eyes were a shade of dark green that he had no useful comparison for, the green of deep river water perhaps, or new pine needles in morning light. She sat very still while Ruth talked, which was itself interesting. Most people fidgeted through long legal conversations. This woman listened with a quality of focused stillness that suggested she was cataloging every word, every detail. "And this is Miss Clara Voss," Ruth said, with the easy comfort of someone introducing a person she had already decided she liked. "She is settling in nicely, wonderful with the children already." Aaron shook the hand she offered. Her grip was firm and dry. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Bishop," she said, and her voice was low and clear and gave him nothing. He filed the papers, resolved the fence dispute on paper, and shook both their hands when they left. He sat back down at his desk and looked at the window and thought about the half-second pause on Tuesday morning, and the quality of her stillness, and the way she had said his name back to him like she was putting it somewhere safe for future reference. None of his business, he reminded himself. None of his business for weeks. Caldwell in 1878 was a cattle town in its adolescence, rough-edged and ambitious, sitting at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a man waiting for a train. The Longhorn drives came through from Texas in the spring and summer, and the town swelled with drovers and cattle buyers, and the men who followed cattle money wherever it led. There were 4 saloons and 2 churches, and a newspaper that had been publishing for 3 years with varying degrees of accuracy. There was a sheriff named Walt Prout who was competent but tired, and a deputy named Clem Hoover who was enthusiastic but inexperienced, and between them they maintained a reasonable approximation of order. Aaron fit into Caldwell the way a well-made tool fits into the hand that uses it. He was tall, dark-haired, with the kind of sun-darkened face that came from years of riding out to verify homestead claims in all weathers. He was not the most sociable man in town, but he was known as honest and fair, which in Caldwell carried a value that charm could not easily match. He had a house at the edge of the main street, small and well-kept, and he had a horse named Jasper who was a deep bay with excellent manners, and he had a small library of books that he had been accumulating for years, paying the freight costs on them because they were heavy and the freight costs were not cheap. He was not lonely. He was clear-eyed about this distinction. A lonely man pines. Aaron Bishop had simply not yet found anything that fit the particular shape of the space he had left open in his life, and he had become practiced at not examining that space too closely. Then she came to Callaway Creek, and the space began to make itself known in inconvenient ways. He saw her at the general store in the first week of May, negotiating the price of paper and ink for the children's lessons with a patience and a quiet practicality that made the storekeeper, old Pete Granger, look faintly surprised. Pete was not accustomed to being outnegotiated, particularly not by quiet women in worn gray dresses. But she managed it without ever raising her voice or abandoning her composure, and she walked out of the store with twice the paper and ink she had come in for at the price she had originally stated. And Aaron, who had been there to collect a package from back east, watched the whole thing with the complicated feeling of a man who is finding something interesting in a place where he had not expected to find anything at all. He tipped his hat as she passed him in the doorway. She nodded and said good afternoon and did not slow her step. In the second week of May, he rode out to Callaway Creek to verify the resolution of the fence line matter, and found the children of the settlement arranged under the shade of a large cottonwood tree, seated on rough boards laid across stones, while the woman who called herself Clara Voss stood before them with a piece of chalk and a writing board nailed to the trunk of the tree. She was teaching them to read. He sat on his horse at a respectful distance and watched for a moment before she noticed him. When she turned and saw him, something moved through her face very quickly, a flash of what might have been alarm, before her expression settled back into its habitual composure. She raised one hand in a brief acknowledgement and turned back to her students. He did not linger. He found Ruth Callaway in the farmhouse and completed his business and rode back to town, and that evening he sat in his small house with a book open on his knee that he did not read, thinking instead about the flash of alarm and what it meant and what she was afraid of. He was a careful man. He did not jump to conclusions. He gathered information the way a patient man gathers wood for a fire, adding one piece at a time, and he waited to see what shape the fire would take. What he gathered over the following weeks was this: she was educated well beyond what a typical housekeeper might be expected to be. She spoke with a precision that came from formal schooling, not the rough, practical education of the frontier. She had opinions about books and was not shy about defending them when Ruth Callaway's reading circle met on Fridays, though she was careful to frame her opinions as questions rather than declarations. She did not talk about where she had come from beyond vague references to the East. She did not receive letters. She did not send them. And occasionally, in unguarded moments when she did not know she was being observed, she had an expression on her face that was not sadness exactly but was adjacent to it, the look of a person who has had to leave something behind and is not entirely certain it was the right decision. He gathered all of this and held it in the back of his mind and said nothing, because it was not his business, and because, whatever trouble she had left behind, she was clearly not bringing it here, and the woman teaching reading under the cottonwood tree was clearly doing more good in Caldwell than harm. June came in hot and dry, the way Kansas June tends to, and with it came the first cattle drives, and Caldwell filled up with Texas drovers who spent their wages fast and loud. The town's character shifted in these weeks, becoming louder and more volatile, and the line between festivity and trouble grew thinner. Sheriff Pruitt's office lantern burned late. Eva Hart, which was the name she had left behind in Missouri, had grown up the daughter of a judge in a prosperous household in St. Louis. She had been educated well because her father believed in education, and because her mother had died early enough that her father had not had the heart to send her to a lesser life than the one he could provide. She had read law in her father's library and history and literature, and had been, by the age of 25, a well-educated woman with excellent prospects, and absolutely no idea that those prospects were about to be dismantled entirely. The man who dismantled them was named Frederick Holt, and he was a banker, and he was the sort of person who had learned to wear respectability the way a wolf wears wool, so thoroughly that most people never looked beneath the surface. Her father had not looked. He had arranged a betrothal with the confidence of a man making a sound investment, and Eva had agreed because she had trusted her father, and because Frederick Holt was charming in the way that certain people are charming before you understand what the charm is protecting. She found out what it was protecting in December of 1877, when she came upon Frederick Holt in the records room of her father's courthouse briefing another man about a land fraud scheme that was, by Eva's rapid and horrified accounting, substantial enough to ruin a significant number of people who could not afford to be ruined. She stood in the doorway for 3 seconds before she retreated without being seen, and she spent 4 days in a state of careful, terrified thought before she made 2 decisions. She would not marry Frederick Holt, and she would not tell her father yet, because her father's relationship with Holt was tangled enough that exposing Holt would require evidence that she did not yet have. What happened next happened quickly and badly. Holt somehow learned that she had been in the records room, though she never discovered how. He came to see her, and his charm stripped away like paint in rain, and what was beneath it was cold and specific in its menace. He told her that if she said anything about what she had heard, he would ruin her father. He explained, with terrible precision, exactly how he would do this. He explained that it would be better for everyone if she understood her position and accepted it. She accepted nothing. She left St. Louis inside of a week, taking what she could carry, leaving a letter for her father that said only that she was well and would write when she could, and that he should look carefully at the accounts of Frederick Holt. She took the train to Kansas City and the stage from there west, and she gave herself a new name in a hotel room in Emporia while the Kansas wind tried the windows. Sitting on the edge of the bed with her real name in her hands like a stone she was deciding whether to keep. She kept it, though. She kept it where no one could see it. Clara Voss was the name she traveled under. Clara Voss was the name she answered to. But Eva Hart was the name she carried in the deep interior of herself, and she had not yet decided what to do with it. What she had not anticipated was that the land agent in Caldwell would look at her with those calm, attentive dark eyes and make her feel, from the first moment, that he was reading something in her face that she had not given him permission to read. She noticed him because she had learned to notice. In the first few days after she arrived, she made a study of the town the way a new arrival with something to hide always does, cataloging who the important people were, who was observant and who was not, who would be dangerous to her secret and who would be indifferent to it. Aaron Bishop went into the first category immediately. There was a quality to his attention that she recognized from her father's courtroom, the quality of a man who listened not just to what was said, but to the space around what was said. She gave him a wide berth and was professionally courteous when their paths crossed, and she told herself that this was manageable and that she would be careful. She was careful. She was careful for months. The first fence between them broke in the second week of July, which was not a dramatic event, but which was, in retrospect, the beginning of everything. She had ridden into town with Ruth on a Saturday morning, which was the day Ruth bought supplies and caught up on the town's business. And while Ruth visited the dry goods store, Eva slipped into the small lending library that Caldwell's Literary Society maintained above the hardware store. She was alone in the room, running her finger along a shelf of donated books, when she pulled out a copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch and opened it to the first page and read the first line. She read the whole first paragraph, standing in the quiet lending library above the noise of the Saturday street, and when she looked up there was Aaron Bishop in the doorway, holding a different book, watching her read. He did not apologize for watching her. He did not make a show of looking away. He simply said, "It's a good one." "I know," she said. "I have read it before." "So have I," he said, 3 times. This surprised her, and some of the surprise must have shown, because he said, with no particular emphasis, "I do read, Miss Voss." "I did not suggest otherwise," she said. "Your face suggested it," he said, and there was something almost like amusement in the way he said it, a dry and careful amusement, the kind that does not demand a response but is pleased if one arrives. She looked back at the book in her hands. "Which parts did you mark?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I beg your pardon. The book you are holding," she said. "You are a man who marks his books. I can see from here that the pages have been turned. I wondered which parts you thought worth returning to." He looked down at the book he was holding, which was a collection of essays, and then he looked back at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not quite surprise. Something closer to being seen and not being entirely displeased about it. "The ones about consequence," he said. "The ones about how actions travel further than the person taking them intends." She nodded. "That is what Middlemarch is about," she said. "Consequence. The way the decisions of small people in small places ripple outward and matter more than the world believes they should." "Yes," he said. "Exactly that." They stood in the lending library for another few minutes and talked about George Eliot, and about books generally, and she was careful, but she was also, she realized with some alarm, genuinely enjoying herself. When Ruth's voice called up from the street below, she closed the book, thanked him for the conversation, and went back to being Clara Voss, housekeeper and schoolteacher, with her real heart tucked carefully out of sight. But she went back to Callaway Creek that afternoon thinking about what he had said, about consequence, about the way actions travel further than intended. And she thought about the letter she had sent her father, which had contained no useful information beyond reassurance. And she thought about Frederick Holt back in St. Louis doing whatever he was doing with his schemes, and she felt the weight of her own consequence settling around her shoulders. Aaron thought about the lending library conversation for a week. He thought about it while he was riding out to check homestead claims, and while he was filing papers, and while he was sitting in his house in the evenings with his books. He had met a good many educated people and a good many perceptive people, but the combination of the two, in a person who was also clearly carrying something heavy, was unusual enough to occupy him. He still had not said anything about the name. He had thought about it from various angles and had come consistently to the same conclusion. Whatever she had left behind was not his to expose. If she was a danger to anyone here, he would need to reconsider. But she was clearly not a danger. She was teaching children to read and helping an old widow with her farm and reading George Eliot in the lending library, and whatever her real name was, it was hers to give when she was ready. He was not, he told himself firmly, waiting for her to be ready. He was simply not in the business of forcing the matter. August arrived, and with it, a drought that tightened the tempers of the farmers and a heat that pressed down on Caldwell like a flat iron. The cattle drives had wound down for the season, and the town had contracted back to its quieter self. In this quiet, the rhythms of community became more visible. The Friday reading circle at Ruth Calloway's farm, the Sunday services at the white clapboard church, the Saturday markets, the informal gatherings at the better of the four saloons, where a man could have a beer and hear the local news without anything going badly wrong on most nights. Aaron had started, in a way he did not examine closely, to arrange his Saturday mornings so that they ended at the general store around the time that Ruth Calloway's household typically arrived for the week's shopping. He told himself this was coincidence, and then stopped telling himself this because he was not in the habit of lying to himself. What he noticed in the accumulated Saturdays of August was that she laughed differently than she moved through the world. The world got her careful and composed. Laughter, genuine laughter, was an ambush. It caught her off guard and lit her face in a way that her composure never allowed, and it lasted only a few seconds before she recovered herself. But those seconds were like looking through a briefly opened window into a room that was brighter than the house suggested. The first time she genuinely laughed in front of him was because of Ruth Calloway's rooster, which had followed Ruth to town in the wagon and had escaped into the general store and created an event of considerable energy and noise. And Eva's laughter at the chaos was sudden and real and helpless, and she covered her mouth with her hand, and her dark green eyes went bright, and Aaron Bishop stood there, and felt something move through him with the unstoppable quality of weather. He said nothing about it, of course. He helped catch the rooster. September began the shift of everything. The harvest was coming in, the nights were cooling, and Caldwell had the bittersweet quality of a place settling in for winter with the memory of summer still warm. And it was in September that a man rode into Caldwell from the east, a broad-shouldered man in a city suit that had been made dusty and rumpled by travel, who went to the hotel and registered, and then walked to the sheriff's office and spent a private hour there with Walt Prout. Aaron learned about this from Pete Granger at the general store the next morning. Pete knew everything that moved through Caldwell and was constitutionally unable to keep any of it to himself. "Some investigator from back east," Pete said, wrapping coffee beans in paper with the efficiency of long practice. "Missouri, they say. Something about a fraud case." Prout looked serious when he came out. Aaron took his package and walked back to his office and sat with this information for a long time. He had no certainty. He had a name that was not a name, a half-second pause on a Tuesday morning, and a woman from the East with no letters and no past and something she was afraid of. He had no certainty at all, but he had instinct, which was in some ways more reliable. He rode out to Calloway Creek that afternoon under the pretense of a routine check, which was thin because there was nothing routine to check, and Ruth Calloway, who was no fool, looked at him with the calm assessment of a woman who has seen a great deal of human behavior and understood most of it. "She is in the schoolroom," Ruth said, which was the lean-to addition off the east side of the farmhouse where Eva held her lessons. "The children have gone home." "I will just be a moment," Aaron said. He knocked on the lean-to door and heard her voice tell him to come in, and he stepped into the warm, low-ceilinged room where she was cleaning the writing board, and she turned and saw him, and her composure went briefly precise in the way it did when she was deciding something quickly. "Mr. Bishop," she said. "Miss Voss," he said. And then, because he had decided on the ride out that the time had come, he said, "There is a man from Missouri in town, an investigator. I thought you should know." The silence that followed was the longest and most informative silence he had ever participated in. She stood with the chalk rag in her hands and looked at him, and he could see, with a clarity that was almost painful to witness, the exact moment when she understood what he was telling her by telling her, and the exact moment she understood that he had known and had said nothing. She set down the chalk rag very carefully on the edge of the board. "How long?" she said. Her voice was even, but it was a managed evenness, like water held back by a hand. "Since the first day," he said. Another silence. Then she let out a breath that was not quite a sound, and sat down on the bench that the children used for lessons, and put her hands flat on her knees, and said, "What are you going to do?" "Nothing," he said, "unless you want me to do something. She looked up at him, those dark green eyes. "You have known since the first day," she said, "and you said nothing for months." "It was not my secret to tell," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Most men would have asked." "I am not most men," he said simply, without any particular pride in it. She looked back at her hands, flat on her knees. "My name is Eva Hart," she said, and something in the way she said it told him it was the first time she had said it out loud to anyone in months, and the relief and the fear of it were wound together in her voice like two threads in the same cord. "My father is Judge Thomas Hart in St. Louis. I left because a man named Frederick Holt threatened to ruin my father if I exposed his scheme. I have no way of proving what I know. I could not stay and I could not speak. So I ran." "Tell me what you know," Aaron said, and pulled the other bench from the corner and sat down and listened to all of it. She told him everything. The records room, what she had overheard, the nature of the scheme as she understood it, Holt's visit and his threats, the letter to her father. She told it clearly and without self-pity, and with the precision of a woman who had been living with it for months and had arranged it into order in her own mind. He listened without interrupting, asking one or two quiet questions when something needed clarifying. When she finished, the afternoon light through the lean-to's small window had gone from gold to amber. "The investigator in town may be looking for you," Aaron said, "or he may be working on something unrelated. I do not know yet. If Holt sent him," she said, "he is looking for me. Then we need to know which it is before we decide on anything else." He paused. "Will you trust me to find out?" She looked at him, and this time the look was different from any she had given him before. It was not wary or composed or professionally courteous. It was just direct, one person looking at another and making a decision. "You knew since the first day," she said again, and it was not an accusation, it was something closer to wonder. "Yes," he said, "and you protected a secret you were not asked to protect." "I did not protect anything, I simply did not cause harm." "To most people," she said slowly, "those are the same thing." He said nothing to this because there was not much to say. "Yes," she said finally, "I will trust you." He found out the next morning. He went to the hotel and introduced himself to the investigator, whose name was Joel Marsh, and who was working out of a law office in Kansas City, hired by a consortium of St. Louis investors who had, in the last 6 months, discovered evidence of substantial fraud in the accounts of a certain bank. The bank belonged, in part, to Frederick Holt. Joel Marsh was canvassing the region for witnesses and documentation, and had no particular interest in Caldwell, beyond the fact that the stage route passed through it, and he was following up a lead that turned out to be unrelated. Joel Marsh had never heard of a woman named Clara Voss or Eva Hart, and he had not been sent by Frederick Holt. Aaron went back to his office and sat with this for a full hour before he went to find her. She was at the general store, and she was alone, Ruth having gone on to the dry goods shop, and she looked up when he came in, and the careful expectation in her face made him want to be quick about it. "He is not looking for you," Aaron said. "He is working against Holt." The relief that moved through her was visible and total, and she turned away from him for a moment, facing the shelves of tinned goods and flour sacks, and he gave her that moment because she had earned it. When she turned back, her eyes were bright and she had her composure back, but it had a different quality now, not the armored composure of someone maintaining a performance, but the simpler composure of a person who has put down something heavy. "Against Holt," she said. "He has documentation, apparently. The investors have been building a case. They need witnesses." She looked at him. "I was in the records room. I heard the conversation." "Yes," Aaron said. "You were." She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her thinking, working through it the way she worked through everything, carefully and completely. "If I speak to him," she said, "I have to give my real name." "Yes." "Clara Voss disappears." "Yes," he said, and then, because he had been thinking about this all morning, "but Eva Hart gets to come back." She looked at him then with something that was not quite any of the expressions he had catalogued in the months he had known her. It was something unguarded and direct and a little frightened, and it was, he thought, the closest thing he had yet seen to her without any performance at all. "That depends," she said quietly. "On what?" She looked at the flour sacks for a moment, on whether there is anything to come back to. He understood what she meant. He understood it with a completeness that left him without any ambiguity about what he was going to do next. He said, with the same directness he used for everything, "There is." She looked at him. He looked at her. The general store smelled of tobacco and flour and the iron scent of the wood stove, and somewhere outside a horse was blowing dust from its nostrils, and the moment stretched between them like the space before a word. "All right," she said softly. "Then let me speak to your investigator." The conversation between Eva Hart and Joel Marsh lasted 3 hours and took place in the back room of the hotel, with Aaron present at Eva's request. She told Marsh everything she had told Aaron, with additional detail and with the sharp legal clarity of a woman who had grown up in a judge's household and knew how evidence and testimony worked. Marsh, who was a thorough professional, took careful notes and asked good questions, and at the end of 3 hours looked at her with the expression of a man who has found something of considerable value. "Miss Hart," he said, "your testimony could be the piece that closes this. The conversation you overheard gives us the intent, the planning stage, in Holt's own words. Would you be willing to provide a formal statement?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation. "It will mean giving your name. It may mean returning to testify in person." "I understand," she said. After Marsh left, she and Aaron sat for a while in the back room of the hotel in the quietude that follows a significant action. The afternoon had gone orange through the windows, and the sounds of the street came in muffled and distant. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about this seriously. "Like I have been holding my breath for 9 months and have finally been allowed to breathe." He nodded. "I should write to my father," she said. "A real letter this time, not just reassurance." "He will have missed you considerably," Aaron said. "He will be furious," she said. And then the laugh ambushed her again, sudden and helpless, and she covered her mouth with her hand, but her eyes were bright and undone by it. And Aaron felt the thing that had been moving toward him since April arrive finally and completely, settling into him like a rider coming home. "He will be furious," she said again, "and then he will be relieved, and then he will be on a train out here to see for himself that I am alive and well, and I will have to explain everything, which will take a very long time." "You explain things clearly," Aaron said. "I have noticed." She looked at him. "You have noticed a great deal," she said. "It is a little unnerving." "I apologize," he said. "Do not," she said, and her voice had gone quiet and something in it was open in a way her voice had not been before. "I think it may be the kindest thing anyone has done for me in a very long time, noticing and saying nothing." He looked at her. She looked at him. Outside, the Kansas evening was drawing its long purple light across the plains. "Eva," he said, using her real name for the first time, and just the way he said it, with the care a man puts into something that matters to him, made her eyes go bright again. "Yes," she said softly. "I would like, if you are willing, to get to know you properly. Not Clara Voss. You." The smile that came to her face then was not the quick ambushed laugh and not the managed composure. It was something quieter and steadier and entirely her own. "I think," she said, "I would like that very much." October arrived with the relief that follows a hard season, the heat breaking and the plains going gold and amber, and Eva Hart began the careful process of reclaiming her own name. She wrote the letter to her father. She wrote it over 3 evenings, sitting at the table in her small room at Callaway Creek with the oil lamp burning warm, and she told him everything. Holt, the records room, her flight, the months as Clara Voss, and Joel Marsh and the case being built. She told him she was well. She told him she was sorry for the months of silence and the brevity of the first letter. She told him she was in Caldwell, Kansas, and that she intended to stay. She did not tell him about Aaron Bishop yet, because there was not yet enough to tell, and because some things wanted time before they were handed to other people. She posted the letter on a Monday morning, and in the evenings that followed, she found that a certain tension she had carried so long she had stopped noticing it had begun to ease out of her shoulders and her jaw. She was Eva again, in the open, and it was both simpler and more complicated than she had expected. Simpler because the performance was over. Complicated because she had spent 9 months building a self out of composed distance and careful performance, and Eva Hart, she discovered, was a more turbulent and less contained person than Clara Voss had been allowed to be. Aaron Bishop noticed the change, of course, because he noticed everything. What he noticed specifically was that she argued more. Not with any hostility, but with a directness and a willingness to defend a position that Clara Voss had carefully muted. She argued about books at the Friday reading circle, maintaining her view of Thomas Hardy with a cheerful persistence that made Ruth Calloway smile into her tea. She argued with Pete Granger about the price of writing paper for the school and won, and did not apologize for winning. She argued gently with the minister about the interpretation of a passage she disagreed with and conceded 3 points graciously, and defended the 4th with such clarity that the minister went home looking thoughtful. Aaron found all of this deeply interesting. He found her deeply interesting, in the way that something becomes more interesting the more of it you see, rather than less. Their friendship, which had been conducted in the careful phrasing of people who are aware that something more could exist between them, but are being deliberate about the approach, deepened in October into something that was no longer comfortable to call friendship. They rode out together twice on the pretense of him showing her the surrounding country, which she had not yet had occasion to explore beyond the immediate territory around Calloway Creek. They took the long way along the Kisham Trail, and he told her about the cattle drives, about the drovers who came through, about the way the town changed in their season. She listened with genuine attention and asked questions that showed she had been observing more than he had realized. On the second ride, in the later afternoon, they had stopped on a low rise that looked out over the plains to the south, the grass gone bronze in the autumn light, and the sky above it the particular blue that only exists in October over flat country. She was looking out at it with an expression he had not seen before, something still and slightly awed, and he watched her and thought that, however many years he had been doing this, riding out over the plains in all their seasons, the sight of her looking at them as if they were something sacred made them new. "It is enormous," she said. "Yes," he said. "In St. Louis there are buildings everywhere, everything is vertical, here it is all horizontal, everything is visible for miles." "Does it unsettle you?" he asked. She thought about this. "No," she said, "it feels honest. Nothing can hide here. You can see everything coming." He looked at the side of her face, the clean line of her profile against that October blue. "Is that what you wanted after everything?" She turned to look at him. "Yes, I think so." "I was tired of things being hidden." She paused, "including myself." "You are not hidden now," he said. "No," she agreed. "Not from you anyway." The space between those words and what neither of them said was the kind of space that a single word could fill if either of them chose to speak it. The wind moved through the grass. A hawk circled somewhere in the distances. "Eva," he said. "Aaron," she said at the same moment, and they both stopped, and then she smiled, and it was the full real smile, the one that reached her dark green eyes and stayed there, and he thought he had never seen anything that he wanted to look at for longer. "You first," she said. "I was going to ask," he said, "whether you would allow me to call on you properly, in whatever way is appropriate given the unconventional nature of the whole situation." "Unconventional is a polite way to describe it," she said. "I am a polite man," he said. "You are," she said, and then quietly, "Yes, I would like that." Calling on her properly, given that she lived at Ruth Calloway's farm and Aaron lived in town, meant that their courtship had a frontier practicality to it that was somewhat different from drawing-room conventions. He came to the farm on Sunday afternoons and sat with her on Ruth's porch, and they talked, and Ruth brought out tea and pretended she was not paying attention while clearly paying very close attention indeed. And the November air came in cold off the plains and wrapped itself around the porch in a way that made sitting close together feel natural and sensible. Ruth Calloway had been watching this develop since August with the satisfied patience of a woman who had seen a great many things and knew a right thing when she saw it. She had known from the beginning that the girl calling herself Clara Voss was not entirely who she said she was, because Ruth was 63 years old and had buried a husband and 2 sons, and that kind of experience makes a person very good at recognizing the particular way people hold themselves when they are carrying something they have not put down. She had said nothing because it had not been her business, and because she had decided very early on that whatever the girl had left behind, she was good and she was kind and she was safe, and that was what mattered in Ruth's house. When Eva told her the whole truth in October, Ruth listened quietly and at the end patted Eva's hand and said, "I had wondered about the name. I thought perhaps a difficult marriage." "No," Eva said, "nothing like that." "Well," Ruth said, "it does not matter now. You are here." She paused. "And that young man from the land office is making a very transparent effort to find reasons to ride out in this direction." Eva had looked at her hands and said nothing, but the color in her face had said something for her. "He is a good man," Ruth said. "I have known him for years. He is honest and steady and he works hard and he is not afraid of a woman with a mind of her own, which is rarer than it ought to be." She paused again. "He brought me firewood last winter without being asked. I have always thought that tells you more about a person than almost anything else." Eva thought about this later. She thought about all of it, about what it meant that he had known since the first day and had said nothing, and had ridden out to warn her about Marsh, and had sat in the lean-to schoolroom, and listened to everything she told him with the steady, attentive patience of a man who was not in any hurry, but was not going anywhere either. She had thought for most of her life that she knew what love looked like because she had read about it and seen examples of it around her. She had thought it was a particular kind of intensity, a dramatic arrival of feeling. What she was discovering instead was that it looked like someone knowing your secret and protecting it without being asked. It looked like firewood brought without announcement. It looked like a man saying your real name for the first time with the same care he put into everything, careful and total. November was cold and the plains were brown and bare, and the light came in low and thin. And Aaron Bishop came to Callaway Creek every Sunday, and sometimes on a Wednesday when there was a practical reason. And they talked about everything, the way 2 people talk when they are discovering that the other person is someone they want to know completely. She told him about growing up in her father's house, about reading law in the library, about her mother who had died when she was 7, and whom she remembered as a quality of warmth and a particular kind of laughter. She told him about the St. Louis she had loved and the one she had been forced to leave. She told him about the long stagecoach ride west and the hotel room in Emporia, and holding her own name like a stone. He told her about growing up in Ohio, the son of a blacksmith and a schoolteacher, which explained, she thought, the combination of practical capability and genuine love of books. He told her about coming west at 22 because the land office job had opened, and because he had felt the pull of the territory the way some people feel the pull of the sea. He told her about the years of learning the county, every homestead and creek and disputed fence line. He told her about the library he had accumulated and named the books, and she matched them with opinions of her own. She told him she had always wanted to teach properly, not as a housekeeper's sideline but as a real profession. In Kansas, she had learned women could hold professional positions in ways that were still difficult back east. The territory had different ideas about what women could do. He told her he knew the county superintendent of schools and could introduce her if she was interested. She looked at him. "You would do that?" "Why would I not?" he said. "In St. Louis," she said carefully, "men tend to prefer women who are not attempting to be professionally useful. It interferes with certain ideas about what women are for." He looked at her with the directness that she had come to know as one of his most consistent qualities. "Then I am glad you are in Kansas," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So am I, Aaron. So am I. December brought snow to the plains, the great rolling whiteness that transforms Kansas into something biblical in its simplicity. Ruth's farm was beautiful under it, the cottonwood by the schoolroom draped in white, the creek frozen at its edges, the farmhouse lights burning amber in the long dark evenings. Eva had come to love it with a particular affection, one develops for a place that has been kind to you when kindness was not guaranteed. The letter from her father arrived on the 14th of December. It was long, which she had expected, and it was written in her father's precise legal hand, which made her throat tight with a longing she had been managing for 9 months. He was well. Holt had been arrested in November as the case built. The investors were pursuing full prosecution. Joel Marsh had written to him in October and described their meeting in Caldwell, and had told him that his daughter was not only well, but had provided pivotal testimony. Her father said that the combination of relief and pride he had felt on reading that letter was not something he had adequate language for. He was furious, he said, about the months of silence. He was also, he said, so grateful she was safe that the fury was almost theoretical. He was coming in January, he wrote. He could not come sooner because of the hearings, but in January he was coming, and nothing short of a blizzard or an act of Congress would stop him. She read the letter at the kitchen table while Ruth made tea, and when she looked up her eyes were bright with tears she would not allow to fall. "Good news," Ruth said. "Yes," Eva said, "very good news." She told Aaron about it on Sunday, and his face when she told him had the quality of genuine gladness, not performed but real, the kind that belongs to someone who has invested genuinely in another person's good outcome. He said he was glad, and that her father sounded like a man worth knowing, and she said that he was, and then they sat in a comfortable silence on Ruth's cold porch wrapped in their coats while the snow lay white and still on the plains in every direction. And she thought that this specific moment, this quiet and cold and the sound of his breathing beside her and the knowledge that things were being resolved and mended and returned to her, was one of the best moments she had ever had. "Aaron," she said. "Yes. I want to tell you something." "All right," he said. She looked at the snow. "When I left St. Louis, I thought I was only running. I thought I was only escaping something. I did not know I was also running towards something." She paused. "I did not know that Caldwell would be a place where I wanted to stay. I did not know that there would be a reason here that would matter more to me than the reason I left." The silence after this had the texture of held breath. "Eva," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have been in love with you," he said, with the same careful directness he gave everything, "since approximately the first time you argued about Thomas Hardy." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with those calm, dark eyes that saw everything, and there was nothing composed or professional about his face now. He was simply looking at her without any guard at all, one person being entirely visible to another. "That was October," she said. "Yes," he said. "That means you were in love with me before you told me about Marsh." "Yes," he said, "though I did not tell you then for that reason." "I know," she said, and then because she was Eva Hart and she had learned that composure was not the same as honesty, "I have been in love with you since August, since the rooster." He looked at her. And then that rare, full smile came to his face, the one she had seen only a handful of times, and it transformed him the way laughter transformed her, opening up something that was usually held close. "The rooster," he said. "You were trying so hard to help catch it," she said, "and you were completely ineffective, and you kept apologizing to Pete Granger, and I thought, this is a very good man." He laughed. She had not heard him laugh that fully before. It was low and warm and entirely genuine, and she thought she would like to hear it again as many times as possible. He reached across the cold porch railing and took her hand in his, and her fingers closed around his with the certainty of something that has been moving in this direction for a long time. "Merry Christmas," she said softly, though it was not yet Christmas. "Merry Christmas," he said back just as softly. Christmas passed warmly and January arrived white and brutal, the Kansas cold that comes in off the plains like a slow knife. And with it, on the 22nd, a train bearing Judge Thomas Hart of St. Louis, Missouri, who was 60 years old and straight-backed and considerably large in the manner of a man who has spent decades in a position of authority and has not apologized for it. He arrived at Caldwell's small station, and his daughter was there to meet him, and the reunion was so private and complete that Aaron, who had come with her, stayed deliberately at a distance and looked at the station house and thought about the fence-line files he needed to update. When she brought her father to him, her arm through his and her face brilliant with complicated feeling, Judge Hart looked at Aaron Bishop the way he had probably looked at a great many witnesses, with clear and measuring intelligence. "Mr. Bishop," he said, and his handshake was firm and direct. "Judge Hart," Aaron said, "welcome to Caldwell. My daughter tells me you are a man who can keep a secret," the judge said. "When the situation warrants it," Aaron said. "She also tells me," the judge said, "that you have been keeping an extremely different kind of secret more recently, one of a less protective nature." Eva made a sound beside him. "Father," she said. "I am merely gathering information," her father said, with a dignity that was only slightly undermined by the fact that he was clearly enjoying himself. "I am told you have a library." "I do," Aaron said. "Good," the judge said. "That tells me more about a man than almost anything else." He paused. "That and how he treats the people who depend on him." Aaron met his eyes. "I intend to be very careful with what I have been trusted with," he said. The judge looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once with the finality of a man who has reached a verdict. "Good," he said again. Judge Hart stayed for 2 weeks, which was as long as he could be away from his work. He stayed at the hotel in town, and he visited Callaway Creek every day, and he sat with Ruth, whom he immediately and mutually respected, and he watched his daughter move through her days in Caldwell with the bittersweet attention of a parent who is recognizing that a child has built something real without them. On his 5th evening in Caldwell, he had dinner with Aaron at Aaron's house, the small, well-kept house at the edge of the main street, and he looked at the books on the shelves with a careful satisfaction, and they talked about the land, about Kansas, about the cattle drives and the homesteaders and the particular character of frontier justice. Aaron spoke honestly and the judge listened well, and by the end of the evening they had, with the mutual recognition of men who respect similar things, reached something that was not quite friendship yet but was the foundation one is built on. "She is happy here," the judge said at the door, putting on his coat. "I believe so," Aaron said. "She was not happy before," the judge said. "She was content, she was accomplished, but she was not happy. I did not see it until it was gone." He paused. "I am not a man who admits to missing things, Mr. Bishop, but I missed that. The responsibility for her unhappiness before does not lie with you," Aaron said carefully. "No," the judge said. "It lies with Holt, and Holt will pay for it." He buttoned his coat. "But some of the responsibility for not seeing it lies with me, and I am old enough to admit that." He looked at Aaron. "You see her clearly?" "Yes, sir," Aaron said. "Good," the judge said for the 3rd time, and walked back toward town. The judge left on a Wednesday, with his daughter on the station platform beside him, and their farewell was long and quiet, and ended with him holding her face in his large, careful hands for a moment, and saying something private, and then stepping onto the train with the erect bearing of a man who is not going to look back, because looking back will make it worse. The train took him east, and Eva stood on the platform until it was gone, and then she turned and Aaron was there, as she had known he would be, and she walked to him, and he opened his arms, and she walked into them and let herself be held properly, for the first time, his arms around her and her face against his coat and the January wind pulling at them both. He held her for a long time and did not say anything because there was nothing useful to say and she did not need words, and it was in this that she understood completely and finally what it was to be known by someone. February in Kansas is its own particular difficulty. The winter dug in and the spring still too far to imagine. But there is a quality to February on the plains that is austere and beautiful if you know how to look at it. The great bare sky and the clean cold and the way sound carries over the frozen ground with a clarity that seems impossible. Eva, who had been a city girl all her life, had found in the 7 months she had lived at Callaway Creek a deep and genuine attachment to the land itself, not just the community but the physical fact of it, the sky, the grass, the way weather announced itself from miles away with complete honesty. She began teaching formally in February. Erin had indeed made the introduction to the county superintendent, a practical woman named Mrs. Hale, who had interviewed Eva for 45 minutes and then offered her the position of teacher for the Callaway Creek district, which served 32 children in a settlement that was growing. They were building a proper schoolhouse, to be finished by spring, and until then Eva would continue with the lean-to and the cottonwood tree and the chalk board nailed to the trunk. She was very good at it. She had always known she would be, in the way you know things about yourself that the world has not yet confirmed. The children were varied in their readiness and their backgrounds, and she adapted to each of them with a patience that did not feel effortful because she was genuinely interested in each specific child and what they needed. Some needed quiet and method. Some needed energy and challenge. She gave each what they asked for and watched them grow and felt the satisfaction of useful work done well. Erin came by the schoolroom sometimes at the end of the school day, and she would show him what they were working on, and he would listen to a child read aloud with the same quality of patient attention he gave everything, and the children liked him in the straightforward way children like adults who treat them as if their efforts matter. One afternoon in late February, walking back from the schoolroom to the farmhouse in the cold blue dusk, Eva said, "Erin, when did you decide to stay in Caldwell?" "When you first came west." He walked beside her, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. "Not immediately," he said. "The first year I thought I might move on further. California, perhaps. There was a great deal of land to see." "What kept you here?" He thought about this seriously. "The scale of it," he said. "The homesteaders filing their claims, building their lives from nothing on this ground. I wanted to be part of that, not to build an empire, but to be useful to people who were building their own piece of something real." He paused, "And the library got too large to transport comfortably." She laughed, the sudden helpless laugh. "The library," she said. "It was a contributing factor," he said, completely seriously, and she laughed again. They walked in the winter dusk and their shoulders were touching, close enough together that the cold seemed less, and she thought, not for the first time, that this was what it felt like to have found the right person. Not fireworks and speeches. This, walking in the cold and laughing about a library and being known completely by the person beside you. He proposed on the first day of March, which arrived with a wind that was the first breath of possible warmth after the long winter cold. He proposed on the porch of his own house, where she had come for Sunday dinner along with Ruth Callaway, who had left already with the diplomatic precision of a woman who had been informed in advance that this was going to happen. He did not make a speech. He was not a man who made speeches. He took her hands in his, on the porch in the early March wind with the plains brown and waiting for spring, and he said, "Eva, I want to build something with you. I want the house and the years and whatever comes with them. I want to watch you teach those children and argue about books and negotiate Pete Granger's prices, and I want to be the person who knows you best, the way you know me. I am asking you to marry me." She looked at him, this man who had known her secret from the first day and kept it, who had told her about Marsh without being asked, who had listened in the lean-to schoolroom with his whole attention, who had brought her father to the station and stood at a respectful distance, and then been there when the train left. She looked at him and thought that she had run from St. Louis with nothing but a forged name and a real heart, and that the heart had found its way here to this man on this porch on the first day of March 1879. "Yes," she said. "Erin, yes." He kissed her on the porch in the March wind, the first kiss, careful and complete, and she held his face in her hands the way her father had held hers at the station, and felt the particular overwhelming quality of having arrived, fully and finally, somewhere worth being. They were married in April on a Saturday in the white clapboard church on Caldwell's Main Street. The church was full. Caldwell had watched this particular story develop with the close and proprietary interest of a small community that considers the important events of its members a form of collective drama, and attendance at the wedding was high and warm. Ruth Calloway sat in the front pew and did not cry, but her eyes were bright through the whole of it. Pete Granger was there, which surprised Eva until she remembered that he was the source of all information in Caldwell and liked being present for consequential moments. The children from the schoolroom, all 32 of them, were there in rows with their best clothes on and their faces scrubbed. Judge Thomas Hart came from St. Louis, arriving 2 days before on the train with a suit that was considerably better than the one he had worn in January, and a posture that said he was attending something he had decided to approve of. And he walked his daughter down the aisle of the white clapboard church with the dignity of a man who is very glad about something, and is too reserved to say so simply. Aaron stood at the front of the church and watched Eva come toward him, and his face had the quality of complete presence, of a man who is entirely where he is, which is one of the rarest things in the world. The minister said the words. They said the words back. Aaron put a simple gold ring on her finger, and she put a simple gold ring on his. And when they were told they were married, she looked up at him, and his face was the face she had learned to love in all its different qualities, the attentive and the thoughtful and the rare warm humor. And she thought, "This is the truest thing I have ever done." He kissed her in the church with everyone watching, and someone in the back pews made an appreciative sound, and she heard the children laugh, and she felt herself smile against his mouth. They spent their first night as a married couple in Aaron's house, which had been cleaned and decorated by Ruth and 3 other women from the community, while the wedding dinner was ongoing, with something that struck Eva as both touching and deeply funny about the practicality of a frontier community that decorates a wedding house while everyone else is eating. She stood in the bedroom that evening in the lamplight and looked around at what was now her home, the books on the shelves and the solid practical furniture, and the 2 coats hanging on the hook by the door, his and now hers. And Aaron came to stand behind her and put his arms around her and rested his chin on her hair. "Is it enough?" he said quietly. "It is more than enough," she said. "It is exactly enough." The spring settled into summer, and summer was the best kind of busy, the kind that comes from a life built with intention rather than endured by necessity. Eva taught her 32 children in the new schoolhouse that the community had finished building in May, a proper wooden building with 2 windows and a door that closed properly, and a blackboard that did not need to be nailed to a tree. The county superintendent was so pleased with the school's progress that she recommended Eva for a small additional salary, which Eva used partly for books and partly to start a lending library for the children's families. Aaron's work continued with the steady, reliable character of work done well over years. The homestead claims that moved through his office were the ongoing story of people trying to build their piece of the territory, and he processed each one with the care of a man who understands that the papers he stamps have real lives attached to them. He had, over the years, become something of an informal advisor to new homesteaders, helping them understand their rights and their obligations and the practical realities of frontier land ownership. And this work had given him a quiet satisfaction that he was glad to have. They built their life at the house on the edge of Main Street, which they gradually made more of. Aaron had always kept it clean and functional but sparsely furnished, in the manner of a man who had been single long enough to stop noticing gaps. Eva filled the gaps not by buying things but by making the space feel inhabited, a rug brought out of storage, curtains at the windows, a kitchen garden that she started in the small patch of ground behind the house, and that produced herbs and tomatoes, and the general atmosphere of a house that expects to be lived in seriously. She wrote to her father every other week, and he wrote back with the regularity of a man who had learned the lesson of 9 months of silence and was not going to let it happen again. He followed the Holt prosecution with a thoroughness that she found both satisfying and slightly exhausting in the detail of his letters, and in September of 1879, he wrote to tell her that Frederick Holt had been convicted on 7 counts of fraud and had received a sentence of 12 years in the federal penitentiary. The investors who had been defrauded were being partly compensated from his seized assets. The bank had been restructured under new management. She read the letter at the kitchen table on a Thursday afternoon, and then put it down and sat with her hands in her lap, and thought about the woman who had sat in a hotel room in Emporia with her own name like a stone, deciding whether to keep it, and felt the distance between that woman and the person sitting at this kitchen table as something vast, and also, paradoxically, as something very small, because both of them were her, and the thread between them was unbroken. Aaron came home to find her sitting quietly at the kitchen table and knew from her face that something had happened, and she handed him the letter and he read it while she watched his face, and when he finished he put the letter down and looked at her. "It is over," she said. "Yes," he said, "completely over." "Yes," she breathed. "I did not know how much I was still carrying it until just now." He crossed to her and crouched beside her chair so that he was at her level and took her hands. "You are allowed to put it down now," he said. "I know," she said. And then, because she was Eva Hart and she had learned that honesty was more valuable than composure, "I am so glad, Aaron. I am so deeply glad." "So am I," he said. He held her hands and she leaned her forehead against his, and they stayed like that for a while in the kitchen while the afternoon light moved slow and golden through the new curtains. By the winter of 1879, Caldwell was growing, the town adding buildings and businesses at the pace of a place that has decided to be permanent. A new hotel was going up on the east end of the main street. The newspaper had added a second printing day. There were now 5 churches of various denominations, and the beginning of a discussion about building a proper courthouse, which Aaron was involved in as the county representative. And Eva, in the December of that year, told Aaron one evening by the fire that they were going to have a child. He was quiet for a moment that felt to her like it went on for some time, and then he took both her hands very carefully, as if she had become something precious that he was aware of holding, and she saw in his face the same quality she had seen on the church steps on their wedding day, complete presence, a man who is entirely where he is. "When?" he said. "July, I think," she said. "I have talked to the doctor." He raised her hands to his mouth and held them there and closed his eyes, and she watched him with the warmth in her chest that had become the dominant weather of her interior life, and thought that this was, improbably and wonderfully, the life she had come to. She taught through the spring term, up until the end of May when the doctor suggested she rest more, and she handed her 32 students to a temporary teacher named Miss Abbott, a competent young woman from Wichita, with specific instructions for each child that Miss Abbott received with the slightly dazed expression of someone who has been handed a great deal of information very efficiently. The summer was warm and long, and Aaron was home as much as he could reasonably manage, and on the 19th of July, 1880, they had a son. He was born at home with the help of the doctor and Ruth Calloway, who had come into town for the purpose, and who managed the whole affair with the brisk competence of a woman who had helped at enough frontier birthings to know what needed doing. They named him Thomas James Bishop. Thomas for her father, James for Aaron's father, and Bishop because he was, in the simple and enormous fact of his existence, the thing that made the life they had built together not just a house and a shared name but a future, carried forward. Judge Hart came from St. Louis when he received the news, arriving in August with the same decisive train tickets he had purchased in January of the previous year. He walked into Aaron and Eva's house on the main street and was handed his grandson, and he stood in the middle of the kitchen holding this small weight with the hands that had held gavels and documents and his daughter's face on a station platform, and he was quiet for a long time. "Thomas," he said softly. "Thomas," Eva confirmed. The judge looked up at Aaron across the kitchen. Something passed between them, a recognition, a confirmation of the thing they had been slowly building since January of the previous year, which was the kind of relationship that exists between men who respect each other and are connected by someone they both love without either needing to make a declaration of the fact. "Thank you," the judge said to Aaron. "Thank you, sir," Aaron said back, and meant it entirely. Thomas grew the way frontier babies grow, with a sturdy practicality and a great deal of interest in the world. He had his mother's dark green eyes and his father's quiet attentiveness, and by the time he was walking, he was following Aaron around the house with the devoted purpose of a person who has decided that this specific adult is worth paying extremely close attention to. Eva went back to teaching in the autumn of 1880, with Thomas spending his mornings at Ruth Calloway's farm, which delighted Ruth so thoroughly that she appeared to have reversed approximately 20 years in her general energy. Ruth had, since her sons died, been a woman who managed her grief with practical work and community, but Thomas gave her something different, a specific small person who needed her, and she met this need with a wholehearted attention that was good for both of them. The lending library that Eva had started for the schoolchildren's families had grown by 1881 into something that occupied a dedicated room in the schoolhouse, with donated books from as far away as Kansas City and St. Louis, several of the latter sent by Judge Hart, who had apparently decided that founding a frontier library was a project worthy of his retirement attention. He wrote detailed letters about each donated book and its educational merits, and Eva read them to Aaron in the evenings, and Aaron listened with the affectionate patience of a man who has come to love his father-in-law's particular enthusiasms. In the spring of 1881, they had a second child, a daughter they named Mary Ruth. The Ruth was for Ruth Calloway, who cried, which was the first time Eva had seen her cry, and who recovered herself with the speed of a woman who has permitted herself approximately 30 seconds of public emotion and considers that sufficient. Mary was different from Thomas in the way that people are different from each other even when they share the same parents and the same house. She was louder and more immediately social, expressing her opinions from a very early age with a directness that made Aaron raise his eyebrows and made Eva recognize something that was probably familiar. "She is going to be formidable," Ruth said, watching Mary at 18 months old negotiate the possession of a wooden spoon from Thomas with a combination of strategy and persistence that resulted in her getting the spoon. "She already is," Eva said. "She takes after her mother," Aaron said, which was how he said, quietly and entirely, that he found this wonderful. Caldwell continued to grow and change. The courthouse was built in 1882 and Aaron's office moved into it, which he was pleased about because the new building had better windows and more shelf space. The cattle drives continued through the early 1880s, and the town continued to manage the complicated balance of trail town and permanent community, with Sheriff Prout and his now more experienced deputy maintaining the peace with a reliability that made Caldwell a safer place than many trail towns of its size. Eva had by 1882 been teaching for 4 years and had taught approximately 120 children, some of whom had moved on with their families, and some of whom were still in the district, growing into young people who could read and cipher, and who had, in the way of children who have been genuinely taught, retained something more than skills, a sense that learning was a good and worthwhile thing to do with a mind. She was 29 in 1882, and she thought on the occasion of her birthday in March, the person she would have wanted to be if she had known, at 25, that this was available to her. Not Clara Voss, composed and careful and hidden. Not the Eva Hart of the St. Louis drawing rooms, accomplished and somewhat unhappy without understanding why. But this, Eva Bishop, who taught 30 children and raised 2 and argued about books and negotiated with Pete Granger and knew every homesteader within 20 miles by name, and rode out on Saturdays with Aaron across the plains that she had come to love as her own. She told him this on her birthday, sitting on the porch of their house in the March evening that had the first warmth in it, the warmth you can only feel after a long winter because your skin has learned to recognize the difference. "You would have been all right without any of this," Aaron said, meaning it as a truth rather than a diminishment. "Yes," she said, "I would have been all right, but all right is not the same as this." "No," he agreed. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Thomas was inside making noise about something, and Mary was presumably asleep, and the main street of Caldwell was visible from the porch with its Saturday evening lantern light, and the plains beyond the town were dark and enormous and honest. "Aaron," she said. "Yes. I came to Caldwell with a name that was not mine and a very large amount of fear," she said. "And you saw through the name immediately and never made me feel afraid of you. Not once." She paused. "I have thought about that many times, what it means, that the first thing you did was protect me from yourself." He was quiet for a moment. "I do not think of it that way," he said. "How do you think of it?" "I think of it as seeing someone who needed room to find their own way to telling the truth," he said, "and deciding that my knowing it was not more important than their getting there safely." She turned to look at him. This man she had been looking at for 4 years now, and he was looking back at her with those dark, attentive eyes that had known from the first day. "That," she said softly, "is why I love you." He took her hand where it rested on his knee and held it, fingers linked with hers, looking out at the darkening plains. "I have loved you," he said, "from before I knew your name." The years that followed were the good years, the kind of years that do not make dramatic stories because their drama is of a different order, the ongoing, accumulating drama of a life being well lived by people who are paying attention. Aaron moved from land agent to county administrator, as Caldwell grew into its permanent identity, taking on the broader responsibilities of a man whose community has grown to need what he does. Eva's school grew to 2 rooms, and she hired an assistant teacher, a young man named Clarence Webb, who was fresh from a teaching college in Topeka, and who was excellent with the older children's mathematics in a way that complemented Eva's strengths beautifully. Ruth Calloway, in the summer of 1883, died peacefully in her sleep at 68 years old, which was a good death in a life that had had its share of grief, and she left her farm to the community of Callaway Creek in her will, with a specific provision that the land around the schoolhouse was to remain dedicated to education in perpetuity. Eva sat in the church for Ruth's service and held Thomas's hand, and Mary sat in Aaron's lap, and she thought about the woman who had given a frightened woman with a false name a home and a purpose, and a model of what it looked like to live with courage and without complaint, and she thought that she would try, for the rest of her life, to deserve it. Thomas Bishop, at 5 years old, attended Ruth's funeral in his good clothes, and was serious about it with the seriousness of a child who understands that something important is happening even if he cannot yet name all of its dimensions. Mary, at 3, was less serious, but held her mother's hand with the instinctive comfort of a small person offering what she had. Judge Thomas Hart retired from the bench in 1884, and in a decision that surprised no one who knew him and everything about the situation, moved to Caldwell. He said it was because Kansas was agreeable and the cost of living was lower, and he wanted to be useful to the new courthouse. Aaron's face when he was told, in the careful and slightly tentative way Eva broke the news to him, was the face of a man who is rapidly reviewing his relationship with his father-in-law and confirming that it is, in fact, good enough to accommodate this development. "He is going to want to reorganize the court library," Aaron said. "Almost certainly," Eva said. "He is going to have opinions about every land dispute that comes through my office." "Inevitable," she said. Aaron looked at her. She looked at him. "I would be glad to have him here," he said, and meant it, and she knew he meant it, and that settled that. The judge moved into a house 2 streets over from Aaron and Eva's, which gave everyone a comfortable distance and a comfortable proximity, and he became, with the methodical energy of a man who has decided that retirement is not a passive condition, a fixture of Caldwell's legal and civic life. He sat on the town council. He consulted on the courthouse. He argued with Aaron about land law with the vigor of two people who enjoy arguing with each other and respect each other's knowledge. And he spoiled Thomas and Mary with the wholehearted enthusiasm of a grandfather who has decided that this is one of life's properly sanctioned joys. Thomas, at 6, could already read better than several children twice his age. This was perhaps unsurprising given that his mother was a teacher. His father's house had more books than some lending libraries, and his grandfather was a retired judge who believed in the importance of an educated mind, with a conviction that brooked no exceptions. Mary, at 4, could already negotiate the acquisition of almost anything she wanted through a combination of charm and persistence that her grandfather found entirely delightful, and her parents found, on alternate days, either charming or exhausting. The house on the edge of Caldwell's Main Street was full in the way a house becomes full when it contains a real life. Books on every surface, children's drawings tacked to the kitchen wall, 2 pairs of small boots by the door beside the larger pair and the still larger pair, the kitchen garden that Eva had kept and expanded over the years, the smell of bread and coffee and horse and leather, and the permanent faint smell of chalk from the clothes Eva wore to school. Aaron had acquired, over the years, a reputation in Caldwell that was somewhat difficult to put into words, but that everyone understood. He was the man you went to when you needed someone who would listen to the whole thing before responding, who would tell you the truth without cruelty, and who would find, if a solution existed, the most practical path to it. The homesteaders trusted him. The cattle barons found him fair. The newer arrivals, who kept coming as Kansas filled in, learned quickly that the land office was run by a man who took his responsibilities to the territory seriously. He had also, over the years, become someone that Eva consulted on matters relating to the school and its children, not because she needed his judgment, but because the conversations were good, and because she had found in him a person who thought clearly about things that mattered and was not afraid to say something difficult if it needed saying. They had the marriage of 2 people who genuinely like each other, which is different from, and perhaps more sustaining than, the marriage of 2 people in the first flush of love who have not yet discovered each other's particular difficulties. They knew each other's difficulties. They had had the arguments that all real couples have, about money and time and priorities, and the small accumulated frictions of 2 independent people sharing a life. They had resolved most of them and learned to live peacefully with the ones that could not be entirely resolved. They had come through illness and the hard Kansas winters and a roof that needed replacing in 1882 and a period of financial strain in 1883 when the cattle market contracted, and a significant number of Caldwell's businesses felt it. Through all of this, the fundamental thing held, which was that they were each other's first choice always, for the conversation that mattered and the company at the end of the day, and the hand in the dark when something was frightening. That was what love built on honesty and patience looks like at 10 years. Not the first fever of it, but the deep, reliable warmth of a fire that has been properly tended. In the autumn of 1887, Eva stood at the front of her 2-room schoolhouse and looked out at her students and thought that she had been doing this for 9 years and that it had not dimmed or become rote but had remained, in its essential character, the work she was meant to do. She was 34 years old and she looked the way a woman looks when her life fits her well, not untouched by time but settled into herself, with the quality of someone who has stopped performing anything and is simply present. After school that day, she walked home along the main street of Caldwell, which was now a proper town with a brick hotel and a courthouse and a telegraph office and 2 general stores and the newspaper that had been publishing for 12 years. The Kishom Trail drives were diminishing as the railroad spread and the open range gave way to fenced land. and Caldwell was adjusting its identity from trail town to settled community, with the practical adaptability of a place that has decided to persist. She pushed open the door of her house, and the smell of coffee came to meet her, and Aaron was at the kitchen table with papers spread before him, working on something county-related, and he looked up when she came in with the look she had long since stopped being able to be neutral about. "Good day," he said. Samuel Hicks read his first full sentence, she said, taking off her coat. On his own, not stumbling, he just read it. "Which one?" Aaron said, because he knew the students by name. "The one about the horse," she said, "from the primer." He put his finger under each word and read them all the way through, and then looked up at me with the most astonished face. She smiled, still feeling it, like he could not believe he had done it. Aaron looked at her with the look. "Come here," he said. She came to the table, and he caught her hand as she passed and pulled her down to sit in the chair beside him. And she leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat for a moment in the warm kitchen, while the afternoon light came through the curtains. "Thomas asked me today," Aaron said, "whether he could have a horse of his own." She turned to look at him. "He is 7. He made a fairly persuasive argument about responsibility and the importance of learning to care for animals. He gets that from his grandfather," she said. "The argument structure, yes," Aaron said. "The persistence he gets from his mother," she laughed. "What did you tell him?" "I told him we would see about it in the spring," Aaron said, "which is what my father always told me, which means probably yes but not yet." She settled back against him. The house was quiet, with the particular quality of quiet that belongs to the hour before children come home, a brief peace that Eva had learned to appreciate rather than fill. Through the window the Kansas late afternoon was doing something beautiful with the light, the way it tends to in September, everything the color of old gold. "Aaron," she said. "Yes. I want to tell you something." He did not tense or change. He simply said, "All right," in the same quiet, steady way he said everything. "I think," she said, "that I might be expecting again." The silence that followed had the quality of space being made, of a man taking in something and arranging his interior life to accommodate it. "Are you certain?" he said. "Not entirely, but fairly." His arm around her tightened by a fraction. "How do you feel about it?" She thought about this seriously, the way she thought about things that deserved serious thought. Thomas was 7 and Mary was 6 and she was 34, and they had been talking about whether their family was complete. She thought about the schoolhouse and the full, busy life that she loved. "Happy," she said, and was surprised to find that she meant it completely. "I feel happy." She felt him breathe. "Good," he said against her hair. "So do I." The third child came in May of 1888, a boy they named William Hart Bishop. William for no one in particular, but because it was a name they both liked, and Hart for her father, who received the news by telegraph, and was on their porch inside of 4 hours because he lived, now, 2 streets over. He came in and held this new small person with the same gravity he had brought to holding Thomas 8 years ago, except that now he was a man who had been holding grandchildren long enough to be comfortable about it. And Mary stood beside him and explained to him, in the detailed way of a 6-year-old who is an authority on the subject, how babies worked. Thomas sat in the corner and watched his new brother with a considering expression that Aaron recognized as the expression a person makes when they are revising their understanding of how the world is organized. "He is very small," Thomas said. "You were that small once," Aaron said. Thomas looked skeptical but reserved judgment. William grew into a different kind of person than either of his siblings, quieter than Mary, more social than Thomas, with a quality of warm ease that made people comfortable around him almost immediately. Ruth had called Thomas serious. Eva's father called Mary formidable. Aaron called William kind, and by the time he was 3, this was clearly accurate, the specific kindness of a person who notices when someone near them is struggling and does something about it. By 1890, Caldwell had completed its transformation from trail town to settled community, the last of the major cattle drives having moved further west as the railroads reached Texas, and the need for the Kisham Trail diminished. The town grieved this in a mild way, the way a community grieves the end of the thing that made it vital, and then it found its new vitality in the things it had been building alongside the cattle trade: its farms, its courthouse, its schools, its permanence. Aaron Bishop, at 40, was a figure of considerable standing in Sumner County, which had not gone to his head, because it was not the kind of thing that went to heads that were primarily interested in doing the work well. He had been offered twice a position in the state capitol, and had declined both times with the kind of clear certainty that comes from a man who knows exactly where he is supposed to be. Eva Bishop, at 37, had in 12 years built something in Caldwell's schoolhouse that was rare on the frontier: a genuine institution of learning, with a library of 432 books, 2 teachers, and a reputation that reached neighboring counties. The county superintendent had twice used Callaway Creek as a model for what frontier schools could aspire to be. Eva received this recognition with the same quiet practicality with which she received everything, noting that the model was the children, not herself. Thomas, at 12, was reading things that made his grandfather shake his head with satisfaction and say that the boy had a lawyer's mind, which he meant as the highest possible compliment. Mary, at 10, was, as predicted, formidable, bright and confident, and kind enough in the way she deployed it that people enjoyed rather than resented the confidence. William, at 2, was still organizing his understanding of the universe, but doing it with the warm, sociable ease that already made him one of the most popular small people in their neighborhood. On a Saturday afternoon in October 1890, Aaron and Eva rode out together on the horses they had been keeping for years, along the old Kisham Trail, now quieter than it had been in the years when the drives came through. The plains were the October gold she had first seen from this same direction 12 years ago, and the sky was the same impossible blue, and the grass moved in the same ancient rhythm. She had thought, that first October, that everything was visible from here, that nothing could hide. She thought about that now, riding beside Aaron with the autumn wind cool on her face, and she thought that she had not been entirely right about that. Some things needed time before they became visible. Some things were hidden not because the light was wrong, but because the person looking had not yet learned to see them. She had come here with a lie and a real heart, and had found, on this flat, honest ground, everything she had not known she was looking for. She had found the man who knew her secret from the first day and had said nothing, and in the saying, nothing had said everything about who he was. She had found her name again, her real name, and had found that it meant more now than it had before she lost it. She had found work that was hers in the truest sense, work that continued and grew and mattered. She had found this place, this enormous sky, this gold October grass. "What are you thinking?" Aaron said beside her. She smiled. He still asked her this, and she had long since stopped being surprised that he wanted to know, because that was simply who he was. "I am thinking about the first time I rode out here with you," she said. "October, 1878. I remember," he said. "I told you nothing could hide on the plains, that you could see everything coming." "Yes," he said. "And I told you nothing." She looked at him. "You told me a great deal," she said, "just not in words." He looked at her with those dark eyes that had seen her clearly since the first moment, that had known everything and waited for her to be ready, that had looked at her on the porch that March afternoon and asked whether she was willing to let him call on her, and had said, in the simplest possible terms, that she had something to come back to. "We should go back," he said. "Thomas will have exhausted his grandfather by now." She laughed, the real full laugh, and turned her horse back toward Caldwell. He rode beside her, close, the way they rode, and the October light was on everything, and the plains stretched around them to the horizon in every direction, honest and enormous and entirely, perfectly home. They rode back into Caldwell in the late afternoon, the main street coming into view with its familiar shape, the courthouse and the hotels and the church steeple and the schoolhouse at the far end, And the house at the edge of the street, with its kitchen garden gone brown for winter and the smoke rising from the chimney because someone, probably her father, had started the fire. Erin helped her down from her horse, which she did not strictly need but had never once objected to, and she stood in the street for a moment before going inside, looking at the house with the light in the windows and the smoke and the sound of Mary's voice, inside saying something emphatic and Thomas's voice countering it and her father's voice attempting to moderate, and William's happy, unconcerned sound beneath all of it. Erin came to stand beside her and looked at the house with her. "Come on," he said and took her hand, and they went inside. The door closed behind them into the warm, bright interior, the smell of coffee and the fire, and whatever her father had apparently decided to start cooking. And Thomas looked up from his book, and Mary interrupted her argument to say something about a horse. And William, at 2, walked toward them with the unstoppable, purposeful walk of a small person who has identified where he wants to be. And Aaron Bishop crouched down and caught his youngest son and stood up with him. And Eva Hart Bishop stood in the kitchen of her house in Caldwell, Kansas, in the October evening of 1890, with all of it around her, the noise and the warmth and the faces she loved best, and she felt the full weight of her life, which was the good kind of weight, the kind you carry not because it is a burden but because it is real and it is yours, and you would not put it down for anything in the world.